Welcome to the 128th season of the Canadian Club Toronto, Canada's Podium. For over a century, this platform has been a gathering place for visionaries, public figures, and decision makers to discuss the most pressing issues of our time.
We've been having important discussions and debates around this podium in this country for well over a century. I call this a historic podium of record.
Our club's always been a forum for visionaries, public figures, and decision makers to command attention to the issues of our time.
The Canadian Club is one of the most important podiums anywhere in the world that a Canadian can speak to, tell Canadians what it is that they think, develop those thoughts. And so I want to thank you for that very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today.
Through our programs and events, including our youth and young leaders programs, our diversity partnerships, our joint events, and our media and social media opportunities, we offer you access to dynamic political, social, and business figures from abroad and right here at home.
The platform from which the eloquence of Canada has flowed all of that time, whether it be business, education, politics, sports, arts and culture. If someone wants to say something to Canadians about this country and about the future of this country, this is the venue you choose.
Good afternoon, members and guests. I hope you had an enjoyable lunch. Let me bring us back to why we're here today. Canada is one of the world's top oil and gas producers, and with production exceeding national demand, we send much of our supply abroad, with most of it going to, you guessed it, the US. Today, we will go beyond the headlines to explore how to navigate this challenging moment. Before we get there, let me take a moment to recognize the support of our partners and sponsors. We are grateful that Canadian Bankers Association is our season sponsor, and Air Canada is our official airline sponsor. For the third year, Canada's Forest Trust is partnering with us to help capture carbon emissions related to our events by planting smart forests. Thank you all for your ongoing support. Today's event sponsor is Shell. Thank you for your generous sponsorship. We're also delighted to welcome student tables from U of T's Rotman School of Management. Before introducing our honored speaker and moderator, let me quickly highlight some housekeeping items. Today is a unique opportunity to ask those burning questions about geopolitical threats and strategies that impact our oil and gas sector. Question and answer cards can be found on your table, and we will be collecting them and sharing them with our moderator throughout today's discussion. When you're done with them, just hold them up and someone will come around to collect them. For those joining remotely, please hit the red Q&A button on the right side of your screen when we open the floor for questions. Finally, we encourage you to share your takeaways from today's conversation on your favorite social media platforms and visit canadianclub.org for information about our upcoming events. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker. As president and country chair for the past 4 years and a 16-year tenure at Shell, Susannah Pierce's leadership in the oil and gas sector has been deep and impactful. She has contributed to some of the company's most significant investments in Canada, including a clean technology ecosystem. Susannah has been responsible for integrating and coordinating business investment and operational performance across Shell's lines of business in Canada. She has spent more than a quarter century advancing energy infrastructure projects in Canada and the US and has led corporate relations teams around the world. Susannah is also active on various profit and non-profit boards. She recently joined the advisory board of Catalyst Canada and serves as chair of the Business Council of BC, to name just two. We are lucky to have this conversation with Susannah today as she leaves Shell next week to embark on her next adventure. Moderating the conversation is John Stackhouse, Senior Vice President Office of the CEO, Royal Bank of Canada. John is a global thought leader, best-selling author, and the former editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail and editor of Report on Business. Susannah, John, welcome to Canada's podium.
All right, thank you. Great. It's great to be with you, Susannah.
Nice to be with you too again, John.
Excited for the conversation, and hope this is a conversation. If you have questions, please jot them down. They'll make their way make their way up here. We're going to talk about a lot of things, mostly energy and Canada's place in this new energy paradigm, really that we're now in. I was thinking on the way over here, Susannah, that we have to come to grips with us now being into really a new energy age, and we're seeing shifts that I don't think we've seen since the 1970s, and there will be repercussions economically and geopolitically that maybe we'll talk about, but are critical for Canada to think through. We'll get to some of those questions, but I want to kick off, Susannah, with your insights on LNG, LNG 1, as it's called in BC. Probably not enough Canadians appreciate just how big this project is. It's coming online this year. I think it's the biggest investment in Canadian history, $40 billion, 8,000 people involved building it at its height. So first of all, congratulations to you and all the teams involved in it. We like to criticize ourselves for not getting enough done as a country, and that's true, but here's an example of us getting something done. Let's start with your reflections as a leader, because you know the project as well as probably anyone. What do you reflect on now that it's almost coming online over the last, is it 8 years that it's been in construction?
Well, a little bit less than that, but it can feel like 8 years.
I feel like 8 years probably feels like 80 years sometimes.
Yeah, it can.
But
It can.
As a leader, how do you reflect?
Well, listen, I mean, I think the LNG Canada project, as you've mentioned, it's a joint venture. I'll have to give sort of the background around it. It's a joint venture of Shell, Petronas, Mitsubishi, China National Petroleum Company, and KOGAS. So it's really a global joint venture partnership. And the interesting thing about this project compared to any others is it's an integrated project, which I think is part of its success, which means that each of the partners are actually also producers, and they will also pay the toll on the pipeline, and then they will market the gas that comes from the terminal. And so in its conception, I think it was a project that was set up differently, and therefore I think its success is a factor in part of that. Because when you're looking at marketing gas as only a producer, you have to find somebody to market it for you. You know, if you're a producer, you want to find an LNG terminal that'll take your gas, but we had it all integrated. And so I think from the beginning, that was the setup that was in part for its success. But the other thing for LNG Canada that I think some say is a bit of a benchmark for how to do big projects is it really started with this wonderful concept I use often when I talk about it, that all politics is local. But I actually think on major infrastructure projects, project success is also local. And that really means how you work with community in a Canadian context, First Nations and Indigenous groups. And you need to, right at the beginning, incorporate that feedback. Because I think we have a long history in Canada where we don't. And what ends up happening is you find yourself having to go back to the beginning or restart environmental review processes to incorporate that understanding. And for us, right at the beginning, we started with that. And I like to call it social engineering up front. We call it front-end engineering from a technical perspective, but social engineering is really that engagement. And Michael Porter, who some of you at the University of Rotman will know, shared value. That was a concept also that we used, which was recognizing that communities prosper and companies will profit. And again, it's really a concept that we're in it together. And so in its beginnings, as I said, the concept where you would bring an integrated company, which I should have also added, are also customers in the regions we would be exporting. And then you really focus on community first. You're able to actually build up a project that I think has led towards what will now be Canada's first significant shipment of natural gas to countries outside of the United States in history. And I think that's fantastic. And you're right, I think when you don't live, breathe energy, you don't think about it. But it's the single largest private sector investment in Canadian history. The company, the joint venture, is looking at a phase 2, which couldn't be more timely from the perspective of supply and customer diversification. So it certainly, I think, is a project of national significance. I think it was conceived right. I think it was designed right, and I think it was built right. And you're right, 8,000 plus more when you consider the pipeline that also had a large number of Canadian and workers from across the country. So I'm pretty proud of it, and I'm pretty proud there's some folks here that have been working intimately on it. And of course, you have Goldie Hyder here, CEO of BCC, Business Council of Canada. It really also, last thing I will say, was a project that brought everyone together saying yes. Governments knew they wanted it. Indigenous and communities knew they wanted it. Shareholders and investors knew we wanted it. And this is what I think is going to be a key component of any other project we might want to build in Canada, is that we come together and we say, we want to do this. Because when you don't have that, then you have distraction. You don't have commitment. Now, that doesn't mean that we didn't have opponents. Indeed, there were people who don't like fossil fuel infrastructure. There are people that were not happy about a pipeline or not happy about some various environmental aspects of the project. But you had to work with them. You had to sit down and understand. And you wouldn't please 100% of the people. But in the end, if you can get the majority on side, that's what made that project go forward. And that's why it's going to be shipping gas mid-year this year.
Well, we'll get into some of the opportunities for Canada, not just in this space, but in projects generally. But just sticking with this project, curious what you might do differently if you could go back in time from a management point of view.
Well, of course, we'd all like to do things faster. I think we'd all like to have been able to have conceived, permitted, built, and started shipping faster. I mean, everybody reflects on the fact that Canada has not yet had its first large LNG facility. The United States is already shipping gas through their facilities. They were able to do it a lot faster. There were some basic components of the U.S. that made it different. They were already essentially an industrial place for LNG shipments. They already had LNG terminals, so they were able to flip the switch. But I think they were able to really seize the market opportunity faster than we were. So from our project perspective, even though I would say that our environmental permitting was not delayed, in excess, because we were doing it in conjunction with First Nations and communities, I think that there could have been some efficiencies that could have been made. And I actually think that if I were to look at other energy projects to go forward, I think there's more and more efficiencies that can be made in terms of making the environmental permitting review more efficient between the federal and provincial governments, having some clarity with respect to what needs to be included in that review, being able to look at opportunities to, again, leverage workers between one phase and the next. We're not in that place right now. I also think that one of the basic things that we, again, if you're not in this sector, probably we haven't done enough of is really understand the importance of energy to Canada, not only in terms of the fact that we all got here by energy, the lights are on because of energy, but just as a sector, the importance of the sector to the development and the opportunity for Canada, not only for our own economic development, but as a partner. And you talked about geopolitics as part of this discussion, to countries that want supply security, which for them means supply diversification. And that, again, I think as we move forward is going to be something that's going to be very important to Canada and will be very important to those particular partners.
So energy is certainly about the lights, but it is also about national security.
Absolutely.
And we're hearing that loud and clear from the United States. People may not appreciate, I think one of your early career projects was Keystone XL and helping on that. Not to remind you of that, but...
actually, it was the original Keystone, I will say. My first project was Keystone.
Keystone, wow.
And that is a story, actually. That's really interesting. Do you want me to go there?
Yeah.
You want me to go there? Do you guys want me to go there? I can go there.
Yeah.
Okay. So Keystone, the original Keystone pipeline, was the first sort of big oil shipment from Canada to the United States in years. And I was with TransCanada, now TC Energy at the time, working in Washington, D.C. So I was responsible for a lot of the political engagement and how do we actually get this project done. And what was fascinating about this project is the executive decision-making or the permitting decision was actually a Department of State, because you had to have that presidential order to cross the Canadian border into the United States. And, this was pre kind of oil sands being a bad thing. This was really about providing more heavy oil to refineries in the Midwest and elsewhere that could actually use this oil. And what ended up happening was, I remember running around trying to get the Department of State and the White House to pay attention to this, because this is a project which they had permitting authority on. But I mentioned it only because we were able to get both support from congressional leaders through whom their jurisdictions this pipeline would cross. We were able to get the White House to pay attention and Department of State, and we got it done, without a lot of fanfare. In fact, I remember taking folks from Congress and the Senate, from the House and the Senate, up to see the oil sands and walking around. And this great expression an old friend uses is that a picture is worth 1,000 words, but a visit is worth 1,000 pictures. And it's true. Once people actually came up to the oil sands, they saw what it was about. They saw a lot of the activity in terms of reclamation. It became more familiar. But that project got done because folks had not yet linked the actual linear infrastructure to the upstream emissions. And so this was a point in time when you were evaluating and adjudicating projects one by one, but not looking at the integrated picture. And since then, I think there are governments that tend to do that more. And I think if you're looking at a national framework, where the emissions are component to another project, you do need to consider that if you're considering your overall national emissions. But in this circumstance, the United States was not specifically looking at, well, how many more oil sands projects will I incur as a result of this pipeline happening? They understood it was an important pipeline for the United States. It was a great project for Canada, and it got done. Keystone XL has been in the news very recently. We can go there if you want to, but that is a project, again, where point in time, we were able to say this is what made sense, but you could see how things changed after that, and that sort of leads us to where we are today.
So I want to get your perspective on U.S. energy ambitions, and it's not a sudden thing. We hear the president talk about energy dominance, but the U.S. has been very ambitious on all fronts energy for many, many decades. But what do we need to come to grips with, we Canadians, when we hear the U.S.'s rhetoric, energy dominance, but also see what it's doing on the ground, not just on the coast with LNG, but across the board?
I think it comes to something I said earlier, which was governments and stakeholders, Indigenous groups and communities, LNG Canada, knew what we wanted. We had a shared goal. Okay, in the United States, it's now saying they want to be energy dominant. Well, that's a pretty good vision to have. That's a pretty good goal. As a country, and whatever level of government you're in, what is your goal? What is your ambition? And I think for Canada, perhaps what we've lacked is that clarity. And I think, I've heard anecdotal feedback, when you go to other countries and they wonder, well, what does Canada mean? What does Canada stand for?
So what do you think our ambition should be? If they're saying energy dominance, what's the Canadian response?
I think that we should be, dominance for the world is probably not the goal, but I think Canada should focus on, we're a country that provides for our people, that we provide for the world too. We make sure that we have enough energy for our people, which we do, and that we provide to our partners, especially in a context where if you go over to Japan, and many of you probably traveled to Japan, and you know how isolated they are from an energy perspective. They have no other choice but to look for partnerships. They're also in between and still feel missiles overhead coming from places like North Korea. So they are in a very jeopardized position. And when you go there, you recognize the importance of partnership. They want supply diversification. They want energy diversification. And that's an opportunity for Canada. We look at critical minerals, rare earths. Again, we are a place of natural resources. People used to say we're hewers of wood and all that great stuff. It's very nostalgic. Well, yeah, and we should continue to be. But we're also hewers of great natural resource potential that at the moment feels more stuck in the ground than it feels allowed out to partners that need it. And so I think that there's an opportunity for Canada to provide for its own and to provide for our partners in a world that is more volatile, it feels, than ever. And that's the opportunity ahead of us.
So great ambitions. One of the realistic challenges is that our best customer on energy also wants to be our main competitor, is our main competitor suddenly, and they're putting a lot behind that. How as a country do we modulate to that shift of the U.S. not just wanting to produce more, but dominate export markets that we're competing for as well?
Well, I think that's an opportunity. I think that when you look at the United States and where they export from versus where we can export from, particularly on the western coast of Canada, one of the advantages of LNG Canada was its shorter shipping distance to Asia, to the customers which it would serve. Whereas the United States, you look at Louisiana, that's a Panama Canal conversation. So it's different. So we have opportunities in Canada, I think.
What's the day's difference again in shipping?
I think 10 to 20 days. Yeah. It's significant. Yeah. And I think it's one of those things too where for Canada, the other aspect we have in Alberta and British Columbia is the colder climate. We have natural gas, which is typically at a discount to the U.S. Gulf Coast. So we have a price advantage. We have a distance and shipping advantage. We also, again, have a supply diversification advantage. This is our challenge in Canada right now. We have largely one customer for energy. We're stuck. We're very much at the whim of that customer. So if you're Japan, or if you're Korea, or you're other parts of Southeast Asia, having customer diversification or supply diversification is a good thing. And so that's what they want, and that's what I think we can provide. I also think that it's better to have some more leverage in a relationship with one customer where you have another customer. And in this point in time, we don't really have that. And that, in part, again, is an important opportunity for Canada where it can show that, you know what, if United States policy is going to go one direction, we're okay. We can also really focus on these other customers. The reality, though, the situation we face right now is it's not so easy to just build those projects overnight, as we know. And so I think we still have to recognize that, but not necessarily say that we shouldn't put all efforts into building that over time, because it will take time. But I think just even the conversation that we're willing to look at it is starting to change the dialogue with that one customer.
Let's talk about where that demand may be. Shell put out a report this week that said, or projected 60% growth in LNG by 2040. And that's on the heels of, 50% growth over the last decade, I think, globally. So we're seeing growth on growth. Walk us through where you and where Shell see the growth from. And let's start with Asia, and let's start with China. What gives you confidence? Because we all know of the economic uncertainty in China. What gives you confidence, even bullishness, that there's going to be that significant growth for LNG?
Well, I think there's a few things that give us confidence. One is understanding our customers very well and understanding the relationship that, one, we have with them, but just also the potential for natural gas, which if you can't pipe it, you have to ship it as LNG, that there is in each of these districts in terms of reliable power, decarbonization of heavy industry, looking also at transportation. And so when we see in the various different customer segments where we see growth opportunities, where we also see the backup power or the power that natural gas can provide for backup for renewables. Also, again, we haven't touched on it yet, but AI and artificial intelligence, the need for more power there. There's more gas to be needed. And so I think for the customers, we see growth there and LNG being the way to transport it. You know, I think from a China and India perspective as well, and other parts of the world, when you're really looking at increasing prosperity and lifestyles, natural gas is going to continue to be playing a significant role about that. And again, if you look at how much bang can you get from your buck, a natural gas-fired power plant is something that you can build relatively quickly, doesn't need a heck of a lot of land mass, and the infrastructure is there largely.
What about competition from other suppliers? Start with the U.S. In fact, there may even be an oversupply in the next couple of years because so much is coming online. How are you seeing that level out over the next 5 to 10 years? Well,
again, I think we see, as you've noted, the LNG outlook for Shell just released, in fact, this week. We'll tell you by segment and by countries where we see the growth happening. Again, 40% growth, or 60% growth between now and 2040. A large part of that is going to be driven in Southeast Asia. We will compete for that on a portfolio basis, so cost matters. I would say carbon intensity also matters because that's something which we have an advantage on, I think, in Canada, by the nature of the gas, the nature of how we actually build these facilities. So we are trade exposed. That's very important because that also will drive how we make investment decisions as a multinational. But then also for Canada, when you're really looking at policies that might impact your competitiveness, knowing that those policies impact your competitiveness may not be the right thing for Canada if it's in a trade-exposed industry. What I mean by that to say is that if our growth industries are in trade, we need to look at domestic policy of whether that helps or that hinders. And that's going to be very important for us because, again, LNG, very competitive. We're going to want to produce it. We were going to want to be reliable, cost competitive, and I would say carbon competitive.
But those other supply sources coming online, is that, or how much of a concern of that should Canada have, that we see competitors like the U.S. Have a scale opportunity?
Well, again, at the moment, with the amount of LNG demand we see in our forecast, I don't think Canada should be concerned because I think there's so much growth potential that if we can just get on with it, I think we play a part of it.
Okay. Talk a bit about Europe. Clearly overly dependent on Russia. Who knows where the next round will go in terms of Russia dialogue with the West, but principally with the U.S. How are you thinking through, and how is Shell thinking through that as a kind of mega variable in the global equation?
You know, Shell has had the good fortune of, being very close both in terms of its energy scenarios, being European-based. It understands, obviously, energy very well. And I think, Shell, when we when there was the Russian invasion of Ukraine, had to obviously look quite hard at where it is generating gas. It had a large investment in Russia, and how, as one of the largest LNG suppliers in the world, could leverage that portfolio net trading to actually fill gas demand. What we're seeing in Europe, again, is over the last year, we've seen sort of a decline in imports, and part of that has been as a result of where we see, again, slower growth and not the same sort of industrial demand as we saw as before. We still see future growth, though, where gas will continue to play a role to support some of those renewable power that we saw come on stream or was providing a lot of power last year. Russia is going to be a variable. I would say this, though, and this is something that, regardless of what happens in terms of the peace treaty, it will still take time because investments that were made and proponents or companies that left, you still have to work through how you then get back on stream. That's a commercial conversation. That's a technical conversation. That's also a portfolio conversation, how that gas could be added to your portfolio. So it's not going to be an overnight thing, I would argue. I'm not intimately involved in those conversations, but the one thing I have learned is that we say a lot of things at the 40,000 foot, but when you come to the bottom, the first level, it's a lot more difficult, a lot more complex, and that would include how we bring on Russian gas.
Good question from the audience about India and China, but other countries can be added to this. Shifting or sticking with coal, or even shifting back to greater use of coal.
Yeah, some are not even shifting back, they're shifting forward. I think if I saw in India budget at 75% power, which is coal-based, again, the role for natural gas, which is 50% less carbon emissions, is the opportunity, and we see that again in India as well as in China. Daniel Yergin came out with an article just yesterday in Foreign Policy magazine. For those of you who love Daniel Yergin and you love foreign policy, read it. It's a good article. It basically talks about energy addition versus energy transition, and I think that is the reality that we face. You know, for countries that are looking to grow, for communities that are looking to prosper, move off of even more challenging fuels, they're going to want access to energy, and we see that happening. So energy demand is growing. It's not going down. So how do we meet that in terms of providing energy that's lower carbon is going to be the biggest challenge that we've got. We did produce, and I can get into this a little bit, we did produce a shell, for those of you that follow us closely, our scenarios, and they're actually quite interesting. I mean, scenarios take complex variables and they put them together into scenarios so you could see what could be. We released the 3 energy securities just a couple of weeks ago. We have Horizon, which is how you would, on a normative basis, achieve 1.5 degrees C, mitigate above that, achieve Paris. We have Archipelagos, which is really looking at scenarios in which we have growth of energy, but it's trade and geopolitically constrained. And then Surge, which is really looking at growth of energy in a new world driven by AI. In any event, all of that says that those scenarios, that we will see continuing growth in energy, we'll see continuing growth in fossil demand, including oil and natural gas. Coal will continue to be available. If it's low cost and it's accessible, that'll be the challenge. If we want to achieve our climate objectives, again, those objectives I know are a lot of debate today, it will require quite a lot of investment that is astronomical in terms of its price, requires real systemic change, and again, I think is becoming more and more challenging over time.
Well, and you mentioned in an earlier comment the projected demand now from AI, which no one was probably factoring in, certainly a decade ago. Yeah. Typical ChatGPT search, I think, uses 10x the amount of power as a Google search. So multiply that times all that's going on. We see this in the demand from the hyperscalers, the Googles and Amazons, for data centers in Alberta, gas-rich, to have essentially private source of gas into the plant. How should we be thinking about that as an opportunity over the next number of decades?
Yeah, so I think the interesting thing about AI, and it's great because Shell has had a partnership with NVIDIA, and we've been working closely together as well as Microsoft in AI. And I think AI is very exciting from the perspective that the things that we can do with it to prepare for even just basic things, maintenance of various assets, but the ability to run simulations and to gather and take advantage of data that we've had over 100 years to actually make assessments and to make decisions is accelerated in incredible ways, 100 to 1,000,000 times faster. The opportunity for AI, I think, in terms of the energy transition is going to be, it will require power. And that power is going to have to come from sources which, again, we can have a carbon content conversation on. But AI will also accelerate in many ways our transition. Because if you're able to do simulations, if you're able to leverage data more quickly, The opportunity is you can actually make decisions more quickly. I even think about, and I've not yet spent enough time on, how we can leverage AI in the permitting process. If you have volumes of data on projects that have come before, and you're able to access that data, well then you wouldn't have to spend 5 or 6 years gathering new data. Now, why would you? Why wouldn't you be able to run simulations to understand the environmental impacts and then make assessments and then make mitigation measures? I think you can use AI to accelerate. I also think the really interesting thing and exciting thing about AI is if we actually look at a much more integrated energy system, AI can play a huge role in that. And again, I mean, we look at the diversification of power, we look at power which is off the grid or on the grid, how AI will be able to leverage that, leverage sort of the peaks and the valleys so you actually have a much better integrated system. That's the exciting part of it, which all is to say that we see a growth in energy demand. AI could also help us accelerate the ability to meet that, but it could also make it much more efficient. And I think that's the key component. So all that being said, I think AI, again, will require lots of power. I think we have to look at how we can mitigate that and look at ways of providing it clean power or offsetting that power. But I also think there's huge advantages that can come from AI just because of the efficiencies and the optimizations.
A great point. You've made a compelling case, certainly on the demand side and the opportunity for Canada. I wish AI could answer this question, but I don't think it can yet. How can Canada take advantage of these opportunities? What do we need to come to grips with to move faster?
Again, I think it has to come back down to these are the things we want to do. And I think if any company tries to do too many things, you end up doing nothing well. And so for Canada, if we're clear about what our comparative advantages are, and we also know where we're starting from, like Canada, Goldie, you're going to love this because I'll quote a BCC paper, but Canada really has been driven by a consumption real estate economy. And for those of you involved in real estate, it's all good, it's fine. But you're not necessarily an economy that's driving value add. Mm-hmm. And if we can actually focus on being a country that can focus on these comparative advantages, many of which are resource-based, even biosciences, if we can look at how we actually scale those up and then look at it from a competitive perspective, how do we then create customer relationships, that's the opportunity. But we got to know where we start, and we got to know where we need to go. Much has been written already about the productivity of workers in Canada, how that's been on the decline, how we've seen the decimation of our manufacturing sector. Well, if we can start knowing where we are not stepping up, let's focus on how we do step up. And I think there's many organizations and there's many people already focused on that. My only caution is this: let's not try to do something that we don't already have an advantage in. I think we can scale up the opportunities we have here today. Natural resources happens to be the space where I pay a lot of my time, and then really focus on markets, customers. And I think there is a piece here about brand Canada, where when we look at our customers, how are we uniquely different? And I think in the context of the United States, that opportunity is right in front of us because we're not the United States. We are a potential new partner. We are a customer that they can potentially rely on. But that requires a real linkage between our trade agreements, our new trade agreements, and again, our comparative advantages and the investment climate here in Canada.
There's remarkable political alignment. We'll see how long it lasts, but quite significant right now about building more, getting more done, getting it done faster. Not a lot of coming to grips with what is involved to do that. What do we need to think through in terms of building more, especially natural resource projects, and building them faster, while also maintaining our commitments, not just commitments, but desire to do things responsibly and sustainably?
Yeah. Again, I think we have to be very thoughtful and selective about where we're going to invest our time. Again, it comes back to not trying to do everything, but trying to stay focused. If I look at just taking the LNG Canada project as an example, we spent a lot of time up front, not only understanding the technical merits, where could we actually build this facility, but again, a lot of the community, as well as the Indigenous levels of support or alignment. And so we spent time up front trying to say, is this a place where we could win technically from a local community Indigenous perspective, from a commercial perspective? And then we were able to actually invest the time and move forward. I think that we have to make sure that when we invest time in moving projects forward, we understand those basics. And then we work to accelerate, again, the permitting process where we already have experience, non-unique risks. If you already have experience on a pipeline, for example, going through a particular type of land or area, you shouldn't necessarily have to spend years collecting more data. You could actually be able to leverage data in very light scenarios. But I think if you're going through unique territory where there's unique environmental impacts, then you need to do more studies. But where we have existing infrastructure already been done before, let's not spend a lot of time in those areas. I think we can remove potentially some of the discretionary aspects of decision making. I think we should look at projects that provide significant benefits to stakeholders, but that we should also not necessarily provide a lot of discretion. So you spend all that time up front investing in a project where it gets turned down at the end. So I think we can remove some of the discretionary aspects of it. And then
when you say discretionary, do you mean at the political level?
Yeah, generally speaking. I think if a project has met all that it's required to do under the permitting process, and at the beginning has been able to say, yes, this is a project that's in the national interest, it would be terrible if at the end of all of that, a decision is made where it's not. Because you've attracted customers, investors, and then you've said, no, we don't want it anymore. That has killed investment in Canada. That would kill investment going forward. So those would just be some areas, but it comes back down to this is who we want to be, this is the country we want to be in terms of providing resources to the world, and this is the types of ways we'll invite investors in.
Reconciliation is also a critical part of this, and particularly in British Columbia with commitments to FPIC. How do we balance the desire to do more and to do more faster while also respecting our commitments and values around reconciliation?
Well, I think it's partnership and it's collaboration right up front. Again, I think if you're right up front having the engagements with the First Nations and Indigenous groups and seeking, as I said at the beginning, some alignment on the project, is this a project that you would consider working on, having a part of, then you are actually moving forward in reconciliation. And I won't speak for Crystal Smith, who many of you might have heard of or know of. She is the elected chief councillor of the Haisla First Nation. She's also the person who's had large responsibility with Cedar LNG, which is going to be one of the largest Indigenous investments in Canadian history. I mean, the partnership started before Crystal with Alice Ross, but it was one where we sat across the table and we said, how do we work together? And I think the history in Canada has been, and the history of the First Nations, and they would speak for themselves, is that hasn't always happened. Is that projects and investments have come into their traditional territory and they have not had a conversation with the nation. And that has been part of the problem. So I think reconciliation moves forward when you consider the table together and you could find ways of what's in their interest, what's in your interest in a real partnership and collaborative way. And that's how you get it done.
But there's often more than one nation, more than one community, and one of the reasons it takes time is that
you do need to do that.
All of this with multiple communities with their own complexities, which all of our communities have. So I still wonder how to square that challenge of the need
it's not an easy one.
And the need actually to maybe go slow and have that community engagement.
It is not an easy challenge to solve, partly because especially if you're going into areas where communities have never had industrial development, you will have to take time and you will have to work with the communities, many of whom may not even have their own resources to review projects. In fact, I know a number of nations that get so many project proposals, they just don't have the capacity to read all of them. So it is our reality. I would say, though, that if you're looking at investing in a project, you can already, hopefully, through your engagements, know whether a community is prepared, both in terms of their interest in a project and they can accept this project, capacity to actually invest time in it, to say, okay, this is a place I should spend time moving forward. If not, you need to build that into your overall project evaluation. And that is just our Canadian reality. That's nothing that you can short circuit, as you say, but you can look for opportunities where you see nations that would be more inclined to work with you.
All of this also has a climate consequence. If we get all the projects that are on the table moving just on West Coast LNG, I think it's going to be 5% of the global supply at completion, which would be extraordinary from an economic point of view, but also come with an emissions consequence for Canada. And you've thought a lot through these challenges. And an earlier comment, you suggested that maybe our construct isn't actually what it should be. So help us think through where that climate construct may need to evolve over the coming years so that we are able to produce more for a world that's going to demand and use more, whether we're part of it or not, while also maintaining our own goals.
Yeah. Again, recognizing the question is a bit of a minefield in today's political environment. I would say this. I think good climate policy, and this is even from the IPCC, if you would choose to read them themselves, would say good climate policy is not siloed climate policy, which means we all know that GHG emissions are global. And if you have siloed the carbon policy, so you're trying to construct how you would meet your climate emissions in a small jurisdiction, then that's not effective policy. And I think Canada's challenge is that we have siloed climate policy that doesn't communicate with each other. I would broaden the framework if you're going to have a climate policy in which you're able to essentially look at things like carbon trading so that you have emissions, for example, in one jurisdiction because they happen to have an industrial base, they might actually be an export area, they might even be a Pacific gateway, that you could offset those emissions by investing in wind power in another where the actual wind resource would be better, or where you can have carbon capture and sequestration. So that is all to say that if you have a broader market in which you can make an investment but then also deal with the emissions from a carbon offset or investment perspective, that makes more sense to me. I also think that if you look at, even just the genesis of global agreements on carbon, they generally have been how do you manage global carbon emissions, but that also means that you have countries communicating with each other and trading, and that's the concept of Article 2. You've heard about ITMOs. No, very difficult, I think, in reality to do, but that whole concept is recognizing that some jurisdictions will have more emissions that need to be offset in jurisdictions that have the ability to do that, and that is one piece. Obviously, we all know that carbon policy does not sit in a vacuum, and this is our big challenge, and I think a challenge we've had in Canada where you can't just assume you can be successful in carbon policy if it actually impacts the economy, if it actually impacts people's jobs, if it actually has an impact where you become less competitive in those industries in which you would like to serve customers and are trade exposed. So those are some other considerations that we need to take into account. Again, even the Fraser Institute would say that carbon tax is probably a great policy for dealing with carbon emissions if it's revenue neutral, but there's been no place that's actually been successful in achieving that. I think it's a challenge, but I do think I'll go back to the first thing I said. Best climate policy is not a siloed climate policy. If Canada wants to continue in climate policy, I think it needs to look at how it can broaden it so that it can take advantage of opportunities where emissions are increased and opportunities where they can be decreased or offset. And again, that can be a part of a framework that also looks at the advantage that we have in, over time, providing lower carbon product to the world, frankly, which climate will still be a consideration. Climate is still having an impact, or climate is still being impacted by emissions that are generated by people. That is still a factor we need to consider over time, and that's certainly a factor that Shell continues to look at quite seriously in its investment.
As a major exporter, and one that will export a lot more of LNG, but also other fossil fuels for decades to come, one of our challenges has been assessing the impact of this. So Article 6 was a construct very hard to execute on because you can't prove what that LNG is actually displacing or stopping. And we've wondered, can there be kind of broader approaches, sort of market approaches rather than an activity-based approach where it's not an accounting process? So that's part of a conversation. But I wonder strategically how we should be thinking as a country to export more, perhaps to displace dirtier sources, coal being one of them, knowing that you probably can't be so precise as to say this ship of LNG is going to lead to that coal plant shutting down. But conceptually, we know it eventually leads to that. Yeah,
it is a bit of an accounting problem, indeed. And I think that's where, to some extent, if you can look at countries that already have emissions trading systems or that already have carbon policy where you can actually say a unit here is a unit there, that's a better opportunity to have that alignment. I think, again, on the prospect, or just the basic principle that carbon policy should be not siloed, we do need to look at that as a lever if Canada is going to continue to be committed to its contributions under Paris, or nationally determined contributions under Paris. But those are, again, we have to fully commit to doing that, and we have to fully consider that that's part of our carbon policy. And again, I think there's more emphasis or more effort that needs to be made there.
Okay. We've got just a couple of minutes left and covered a lot here. It was great conversation, Susannah. I wonder if we can move towards close and get your thoughts about where we are at as a country. It's been an extraordinary number of weeks, from anthem singing to celebrations to people making different choices on all sorts of things. You're a great Canadian. You think a lot about the country, but you're also at the nexus of some really interesting questions as we've been talking here. Just stepping back, in 2025, what do you hope we as Canadians will think through from a challenge point of view, but also as you've been talking here from the opportunity point of view for us?
Yeah. Well, John and I were talking over lunch, and I was just remarking, I think it was Angus Reid that came out with a survey in December saying that Canadian pride was at the lowest ever in so many decades. And yet you look at Canadian patriotism and pride today, and it's shot straight up as a result of that great day, January 20th, which will live in infamy. But, you know, here we've really, first thing is, I think we've seen that Canadians still care about being Canadian. You know, it's really funny. In grad school, I wrote this analysis, which was really looking at, are Canadians so much different than Americans? And, you know, just kind of doing a content analysis, looking at what we read and what we view. And, you know, what I saw from that is that there's some unique things that Canadians like to emphasize because it makes us not American. And I think those things are starting to play up a little bit. And it's not just winning, you know, a hockey tournament. It's more than that. But I also think that that is a signal to lean in on those things which make us different and to emphasize that, because that will be where we will find our passion and potentially the opportunity for us to continue to be unique and different. And that will be tied to, I think, again, coming back to where we have comparative advantage, and we've talked about it. We've got natural resources, we've got critical minerals, rare earth. You know, we have opportunity in uranium. We have great opportunity also in other sectors. So if we lean in again on that which makes us different, where we have comparative advantages, and then we produce and take advantage of those comparative advantages in a unique Canadian way, I think that will continue to keep our Canadian identity strong. It also will enable us to pay for those things that we like to believe are still important to Canadians, and that continues to be healthcare. That continues to be, you know, the way that we do look at environmental policy and climate policy even. So that might not be a very specific way to say it, but I will say this, that we're at a really important point in time where we've already seen that Canadians still care about being Canadian. I think it's opened up the opportunity for us to see where we also lack ability to be successful if we don't take advantage of opportunities today that have been clearly identified in the United States. And again, productivity is one of those. How we look at investment climate in Canada is another. And there's lots of areas where we could start to tick the box on what we could do differently. Corporate taxes being one, personal taxes being one, delays in regulatory processes and credibility. But then really saying our competitive advantages are here, lean in on those. Let's start to be a country that's open for business outside the United States, and let's move forward. The challenge is going to be this, is that if for one reason or another the threat south of the border as we see it changes, will we still have momentum? Will we still have enthusiasm? It's very quick to forget. I really hope our leaders, and that each of you in this room, will spend time saying, let's not forget. Because the opportunity that's been created south of the border is we've had a wake-up call. And that wake-up call has forced us to ask ourselves some questions. And I think we need to answer those questions and then move forward if we want to come back to continue to be that unique and different human race in Canada, and that's in Canada. So that's where I'd say we lean in, we don't lose advantage of the momentum, and that will continue to create the Canada that is, again, unique from the United States.
What a great message to wrap up at the Canadian Club.
Yeah,
Susannah,
okay.
thank you. That's wonderful.
That was a mic drop. Susannah, on behalf of Canadian Club Toronto, thank you for presenting a reasoned and inspiring strategy for how Canada can embrace challenges faced by the oil and gas industry. Certainly had a number of takeaways from this conversation. Success is local is one of them. The importance of working with stakeholders. Demand for energy is high and will continue to be high. And let's go brand Canada. Your contribution to this important sector has been really inspiring, and so please accept our best wishes as you transition from your current role. John, as always, thank you for your deft moderation of this captivating conversation. You are always welcome at the podium. Before we close, I want to invite our audiences to visit our website, canadianclub.org, for more information about our upcoming events. Tomorrow, we will feature an International Women's Day event focusing on gender equality, and there's still time to register for the online stream. On March 24th, we welcome Michael Rousseau, CEO of Air Canada. And on March 26, we are honored to hear from Chief Cindy Woodhouse of the Assembly of First Nations, who will present their latest national economic statement. Please consider becoming a member if you haven't already done so. We offer access to our events on demand and live stream for free. Finally, I would like to thank our AV supplier, VVC Live, for its impressive and reliable support. Members and guests, thank you for joining us today. We hope to see you again soon.